Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Paige Fortna. I'm the chair of the political science department here at Columbia. And on behalf of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies and the political science department, welcome to this panel on the first year of Trump 2.0 in terms of foreign policy and national security. Before we start, I want to thank Ingrid Gersman and O.G. Grinberg and the whole staff of Saltzman for putting on yet another terrific event. It has been a head-spinning year.
Week.
Minutes. Yes. The sense of time is very messed up. I think we all have lost count of the number of events that in normal times would have been considered momentous and in the news cycle for days, if not weeks, and discussed by all of us for weeks and months and years. And instead, 20 minutes later, another momentous event happened, or the next day, or whatever. And so just kind of keeping track of everything that is happening and has happened this year is head spinning. So to help us begin to make sense of it all, we have an excellent and fully interdisciplinary panel to think through what have been the most significant changes in foreign policy and national security arenas in this first year of Trump's second administration. So immediately to my left is Tim Naftali, who is a senior research scholar at SIPA and an eminent presidential historian. To his left, at least physically, I'm not sure where everybody is politically, but physically, is Elizabeth Saunders, the director of the Saltzman Institute and a professor of political science. She focuses on international relations and policy. And to her left is Matt Waxman, the Librescu, can I pronounce that right? Okay. Professor of law, who works on national security law. So I feel like there should be some joke about a historian, a political scientist, and a lawyer walking through the bar.
I never leave.
Or the bartender says, "What you'll have," and they all say simultaneously, "It's complicated." I don't have the punchline, but it seems
martini.
There should be a joke there. But they will help us at least begin to make sense of the complicated, which it certainly is. So our plan is we're going to start off with each of them talking for about 5 minutes, addressing a prompt that actually came from a member of the audience. I don't know who, somebody sent it in online, but it was a great kind of general question for everybody to start with. And then I have a few questions that also came from the audience that I will float, and then we will also open it up. And I'm hoping we'll also get some questions amongst the three of you or the four of us, and a little bit of discussion and back and forth too. So the prompt question, the first question is, what has been the most consequential foreign policy decision taken in the last year? And you have many, many to choose from. So, yeah,
come back and you see into the mic.
Oh, sorry. Thanks.
Thank you, Paige. As of 4:12 p.m. this afternoon, as you know, by 4:13, perhaps it would be different. I nominate, I got permission to give you two. I nominate two decisions, and I nominate them because they signal a shift in the basic philosophy of the United States in its foreign policy. The first were the Liberation Day tariffs, not because the placing of tariffs was antithetical to modern American foreign policy. President Biden used tariffs. It was the impulsive, non-rational chart of tariffs that signaled that the United States no longer had a serious government. The fact that we were placing tariffs on penguins, while funny, signaled that we were no longer a serious player in international economics. That's a fundamental change. Protectionism comes and goes, but it was the tone that was set by the Liberation Day tariffs and also the promise that was made. And the fact that then the government of the White House then forced self-confident, self-respecting governments to come on bended knee to negotiate special exemptions or a lowering of those tariffs. I was fundamentally at odds. We can have a debate about the United States in the Cold War and how it acted as a hegemon, but it was fundamentally at odds with the philosophy, at least the stated philosophy, of a series of Democratic and Republican presidents. That's number one. Number two, it's not the abduction of Maduro that was the signal of different change in the philosophy of American foreign policy. After all, the United States, when George Herbert Walker Bush was president, brought back for trial, rendered for trial, General Noriega. It was what the United States said its stated objective was afterwards, what the president said it was. But again, we can have a debate, happy to do it, about American motives in the Cold War. I am among those who believes that they were primarily security related. The United States may have at times and did exaggerate the Soviet threat. But I would remind you that the great quagmire of American foreign policy in the Cold War was Vietnam, a place with no resources whatsoever at the time. The United States was not engaged in its activities in the world in search of resources. Saying that America now controls the oil resources of Venezuela ran smack in opposition to the American approach in the modern era in the Western Hemisphere, not prior to 1931. Prior to 1931, yes, the United States did engage in this, but I'm talking about the modern era. So those are two areas where the current White House made decisions that I think fundamentally altered the basic philosophy and approach to foreign policy by this country.
I'm glad you didn't steal mine. I was worried there for a second. So
I'm not hegemon.
So first of all, thanks everyone for coming. This is sort of, these kinds of things are how I try and figure out what I think. So I don't have any great answers, but it's good to talk through what I think. So I was trying to come up with what one, and I tried to mentally, and I have been trying hard to not forget all of the moments, right? And, you know, I was thinking about, in particular, the ones we've forgotten about, like Doge, and, you know, the gutting of USAID, which is a huge, you know, soft power loss of life. But the urgency of those first weekends where Doge was showing up at various institutions, USIP, US Institute of Peace, and inserting itself into all kinds of institutions where, you know, some we've heard of and many we didn't. Like, remember the Bureau of the Fiscal Service? That was one of the very first ones. The Treasury Department bureau that cuts the checks that we get when we get a tax refund, right? It's very important. We've never heard of it. There have been so many, in addition to the Zelensky Oval Office episode, if you can call it that, I try to always remember that he also had the Oval Office spectacle with Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, which was also quite something. When I think about Venezuela, I also try to remember that he bombed Nigeria over the break, and we still don't really know why, I don't think. But I'm gonna go with, even though it may signal kind of recency bias and seem like it's, you know, a cheap and easy way to come up with one, I'm gonna go with Greenland. And the reason is because I think that there are many things, when I teach US foreign policy, which I did earlier this afternoon, we started on Tuesday, today was day 2, it's quite a time to be teaching it. I always try, as I did when I taught it in Trump 1.0, to distinguish between things that are policy differences, like reasonable people can disagree about the policy, and, you know, things that have a precedent and things that are truly unprecedented or that really have no kind of heritage, like in previous policy debates. Because I think it's not useful to just call everything unprecedented, and the word unprecedented is just way overused in all foreign policy commentary, probably all domestic policy too, but that's not what we're here to talk about. When I think about the sort of counterfactual, I see Jack Levy, so he's going to keep me honest on counterfactuals. You imagine a different Republican won the 2016 primary, you know, of the viable candidates. take Marco Rubio. I can imagine eventually he does the Venezuela operation, right? Maybe not exactly the same way. Maybe not with the sort of I don't think he would have said take the oil, but I can imagine that would have been something reasonable people could disagree about. Even tariffs, right? Biden kept a lot of the Trump 1.0 tariffs. Although I agree that the manner was really quite different. I have a hard time thinking of any other viable presidential candidate in the modern era on either side of the aisle who would have proposed acquiring Greenland. Right? I can't think of it. I mean, and my first book was on why leaders matter in international relations and foreign policy, and I don't actually think that leaders matter all the time, right? I think this is one where it's truly like the counterfactual of any other president, and you don't get this latest crisis. The reason I think it's so consequential is because it violated, the norms of territorial integrity. It precipitated a confrontation with allies. And, today we talked about Washington's farewell address in my class, and we talked about how Washington said, no permanent alliances. Like there's nothing sacred about NATO. If it's right. And in 2017, when Trump first came to power, it was very useful to go back to first principles and say, well, this is an alliance that was created to deal with the threat of the Soviet Union in Europe. Why do we still have NATO? Why is NATO going off to Afghanistan? Why is NATO going to Kosovo, right? So questioning basic premises is good in many ways. But picking a fight over the sovereign territory of a NATO ally that will give you every single thing that you could possibly ask for strikes me as something no other president would have done. So with spectacular consequences in terms of the Prime Minister of Canada declaring an open rupture, right? I mean, just think about that for a second. The Prime Minister of Canada declared an open rupture with the United States. That's a big one to me. So I nominate Greenland. Thanks.
Okay, I'm gonna cheat in all kinds of ways in answering this. Yeah, no. It's well, in some ways, I'm like, oh, they stole this. But let me first just say, and one of the things that's remarkable about the first year of the Trump administration is that on the one hand, there have been many things that are sort of surprising. On the other hand, they're not surprising in that he said he was going to do these things, right? He said it during the campaign. He said it in the first Trump administration. So things are both very surprising and not surprising at all. I was going to actually, it's funny guys, I was going to name two things, and I was going to say, there's sort of the first thing and the last thing that were the most significant, tariffs and Greenland. But I was going to say, one thing that's very interesting about both of them, right, is that Trump was exercising a lot of unilateral authority in both. In tariffs, he has claimed and wielded a lot of what's asserted to be delegated authority, right? He's deploying a statutory delegation of vast economic power, and claiming that he can use this to impose tariffs of his choice around the world. That's an issue before the Supreme Court. Any day now we may get a decision on it. So that's sort of a controversial, that's a contested exercise of presidential authority. The interesting thing about Greenland is, I agree with Elizabeth, it's extremely consequential. But it's extremely consequential even though he didn't even carry it out, right? And what
Yes.
I think is in some ways remarkable about it is that it was the mere threat to take a certain action that had enormous consequences. And here's the thing, I mean, I teach constitutional law, foreign relations law, and there's a lot of debate about the president's constitutional power to use military force. There's a big constitutional debate about the president's constitutional power to withdraw unilaterally from treaties. There is no constitutional debate. It is uncontested that the president of the United States has 100% authority to say he wants to take Greenland. That's just unobjectionable. Of course he does. And that in itself for a superpower is a enormously consequential power that's lodged in the Oval Office, and something that he uses to an effect that I haven't seen before. The other point I would just make is, for me, it's really the accretion of a lot of small decisions that he made that have been very consequential. And I'm sure we'll go into a number of these, but in preparing for this, I just sort of was categorizing them as a set of substantive agendas he's pursuing: counter narcotics, immigration crackdown, let's call it alliance realignment, an institutional agenda. You talked about sort of targeting the deep state, centralizing even executive power, further centralizing it in the actual Oval Office. A political agenda, you sort of turning the instruments of the state against political rivals and tilting political processes in his advantage. We'll see what happens in the midterm elections with that, and a very personal agenda, right? Wanting to put the Trump name on things. And I mentioned that last one because actually, and we can come back to this, actually, I think it has a lot of long-term foreign policy consequences to put Trump's name and face on things. That's something he loves to do, but it actually will carry, I think, some long-term consequences, deleterious ones, even for his own agenda, because it so politicizes certain action.
Great, thank you all for starting us off with that. I'm going to ask a few of the questions that people very nicely sent in ahead of time. I'm going to group them a little bit because some of them relate to each other. And I'm also first going to ask a history question of a political scientist and then a political science question of a historian, because why not? So one of the questions that came in, this one's directed to you, Elizabeth, is it said that we can gain perspective from history, but this gets to your point about unprecedented. This all feels unprecedented, at least in the United States. So how do historical cases of perhaps similar patterns under other leaders, and I take that to mean either in the US or elsewhere, help us understand where we might be headed?
Now I feel like I'm about to take a history exam.
They're fun.
So I actually was asked a version of this question in an interview this week, and I was kind of stumped. And then I was trying to think, why was I stumped? Because usually you can reach for a historical analogy, right? That's what they pay us to do a lot of the time. At least they pay you. And I, that's what I do a lot of the time too. Precedents are kind of your stock and trade, right? In the law. And I was trying to think, like, why is this such a hard question? And I think the answer for me, at least, is we have plenty of times, the international system has changed. It's changed a lot, many, many times. It's been, we call it revisionism, right? We had Hitler, who was revisionist. We had Bismarck. We had World War I, whoever you want to say was responsible for that. So international orders come and they go, and we've had one for 80 years, and whatever you think of it, it was pretty stable-ish for a while. But 80 years in the scheme of things, you used to have 100 years war, right? We shouldn't expect that it would go on forever. But we've never, that I can think of, had a hegemon that was a consolidated, if still imperfect, democracy for more than 200 years. That is the declining power and is the one doing the revising. Right, that I can't think of a precedent for that, right? The British Empire was declining and it changed, leadership of the international system changed to the Americans peacefully, which is one of the few times that's happened. But the British were in the process of becoming more democratic, not less, right? Here you have a case of, you know, we can debate about when democratic backsliding in the US really began, but I think you can say it has accelerated in the last year. And yet we still have the United States is still very much the dominant military power. It's still the only power that can really project power anywhere it wants to. Just the very idea of the Maduro operation happening on a Sunday morning and then pivoting to the Greenland crisis 48 hours later, something like that. I mean, it's just no other power has ever had that kind of power projection capability and the speed of the digital age all at once. But it was in the hands of a democracy for, you know, 80 years, and it's now the power is going down and there's a challenger, but the United States is not the democracy it was. And I'm not really sure what the implications of that are, but I think that's why I was stumped. So that's my non-answer to your question.
I'm gonna ask my own follow-up question on that, because you're alluding to power transition theory.
Yes.
There, you know, rising and falling powers. The United States has been at the top of the heap and China is rising. So in relative terms, the US is declining. Is there, and this just came to me as you were speaking, so this is a quarter-baked idea. Is there some way, stepping back from this, to think about the behavior of the United States, and I'm deliberately saying the United States as opposed to Trump, that is a declining power trying to exert power to head off, divert, stem that decline by taking what it can now while it's still at the top of the heap?
Yeah, I mean, I think the British Empire did some of that. There's a famous book by Aaron Freberg called The Weary Titan, and it's about, you know, when did Britain recognize it was declining? But in the period where it was in decline, it was doing a lot of very aggressive colonial things, right? So, I don't think that there's anything magical about democracy that prevents. I mean, the United States did, as Tim alluded to, plenty of terrible things in the Cold War, right? It's not inoculation against human rights violations, territorial violations. But I do think that the ability to try and exhort other countries to resolve their disputes peacefully, like to promote a set of values even when you're violating them, like you get to do that if you're the hegemon because you have more power. My former colleague Marty Finnemore and Henry Farrell have a great piece about this where they talk about the hypocrisy of great powers as an asset. Like it's a thing that great powers use, right? They exhort human rights. They urge other countries to respect human rights even when they don't. And their argument is like, on that's a tool, and it probably does prevent some human rights violations of others, and it doesn't, you know, but it's a complicated thing to grapple with morally. Right now, we aren't even doing that, right? We're not trying, we're just like, you know, notice how Trump always says when he's disapproving of someone else's action, like, well, he was really tough negotiator, he wouldn't give me what I want. He's a good negotiator, right? And then the other day, he went back on his previous praise for Britain giving the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, which his administration had blessed. Like this is a long, decade-long negotiation. And he tweeted that Keir Starmer had made this incredibly stupid decision, right? Because he's not even like there's no norm, there's not even the fig leaf of the rhetorical fig leaf anymore. So it's not so much that the democracies or declining powers, like that if you're a democratic declining power, you're going to do better. Like you'll just take it gracefully, right? But there is a sense in which there's not even any sort of attempt to like put this in any kind of order, right? Or give it any sort of framework. It's a bit chaotic.
You just sum up the whole.
Yeah.
the whole first year.
Yeah.
It's been a bit chaotic. Okay, so the political science question for the historian. So how do you see the US long-term relationship with Canada? If you couldn't tell from the slight accent. Given US threats towards Greenland and Canada's recent shift towards China. And then there's sort of added on to that, follow on that from that same questioner, but also I'm gonna add some bits that some other folks asked about. What about other ally states and what do you think about the future of NATO? And someone else asked, do you think the damage to the transatlantic relation brought by Trump 2.0 will be long lasting? In other words, is the damage tied to Trump personally, or would it continue to haunt a potentially more Europhile future administration? So that's a lot of questions, and I'm gonna ask you to start, but if others wanna chime in on these questions, please do.
I didn't know I sounded like I was in heated rivalry, but maybe when I was your age, I flirted with being a policymaker in Canada, or I opted for an academic career in the United States. And one of the things Matt can talk about his own experience in the U.S. government, but sometimes when you're in your 20s, you find yourself as a special assistant to someone who's rather powerful, and you learn a lot of very cool things. And in my case, I was a special assistant to in Canada, premiers or governors during the free trade negotiations with the United States. To answer the first question, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Canada.
Wait, which province?
Quebec. So my accent is actually a different accent. Je suis québécois en effet, but I speak English and French. So this is a really good intellectual exercise because Canada has been describing itself as a middle power when none of them existed. I remember studying this, and Canada would say it's a middle power, it just didn't want to say it was a small power. And this was a period when the global south was called the third world. And now the concept of middle power makes sense. You've got Colombia, you've got Argentina, you've got Saudi Arabia. There are a lot of powers that Italy, I won't say France. France is still great. But here is the fundamental policy problem for Canada. And it's always been the problem for Canada. From its very beginning in 1867, it needed a hegemon. It has a small population in a large space, and in a space that wasn't actually fully mapped and diplomatically defined. And for most of its history, its hegemon was the United Kingdom. It was the British Empire. The British decided, and were forced, depends on what part of the empire you're talking about, to move from being, as the Russians would say, from being Great Britain to being Britain. And there was a tariff system, a trade system called the imperial preference system, which benefited countries like Australia and New Zealand and Canada. And Britain no longer could sustain this and opted for what was then called the common market. When it did that, Canada lost its hegemon. And in the 1950s and 60s, Canada had to make a practical, this is a very serious country, that had to make a very practical decision about which hegemon and which market it would focus on. It lost its principal market. It focused south. And it began the process of integrating its economy with the United States in the 1960s, when Canada and the United States integrated their auto industry. And then it accelerated this process in the 1980s. But Canada had only 10% of the American population. And this seemed like a good bet. It was a risk, though. It was a risk that Washington might someday decide that it's not interested in a liberal trading order. Because so long as Washington was interested in a liberal trading order and believed in the importance of allies, having a friend in the North with whom you could have joint military defense of the far North, which is what Canada and the United States have had since the development of NORAD in the late 40s, and a country that was a dependable place to invest money and a place you could trade with without fear of a door closing was in the interest of the hegemon. What Prime Minister Carney said was that's no longer true. But Canada's basic structure of its entire interaction with the world was based on having a big, if you will, I don't want to gender this, big sister, if you want. It's now too dangerous. And so the Canadians believe that they are strong enough with 40 million people. They're now 12% of the American population, but that's a big change and it's happened fast. And I want to get to the consequences of that in a moment. They've decided that they can't take this risk any longer because they don't have a reliable ally in the South. Now, that doesn't mean this is an easy road. And it doesn't mean there's going to be some kind of middle power alliance because it's not going to work. A lot of these middle powers don't have complementary economies to Canada's. Canada's a resource exporting country. Canada and Saudi Arabia don't have a lot of, they couldn't build a trading system. But the Canadians are coming to grips with the problem of being a middle power without a reliable hegemon in the neighborhood. So, long-term consequences. Well, the Canadians still need to trade. And there are lots of Americans whose jobs depend on trading with Canada. So basic interests are not going to change. But the Canadian government has got to make some very tough decisions. And by the way, President Trump has accelerated this problem, but it exists already. Free trade was a great thing for Canada in the beginning. Yes, its Gini coefficient went up a little. It's still lower than the United States. Canada's Gini coefficient is about the same as Germany's. But what was more important was its per capita income went up. And until 2016, Canada outperformed in terms of the percentage growth of its GDP every other OECD country. It was a great deal for Canada. And then it stopped being a great deal. And Canadian economists are debating why. But Canada has been suffering low growth and a productivity gap. Its labor productivity has been going down, and it didn't start with Trump. Canada did not recover from the pandemic as well as the United States. There is something not going on. There's an economic problem in Canada. It has nothing to do with tariffs. Tariffs only exacerbate the problem. And in fact, right now, most Canadian products are still being imported here because USMCA hasn't changed. And it actually will stay in force for a number of years. So the Canadians have their own problems to deal with. And Carney appears to be the kind of person who can think them through, but Canada has a lot of work to do at home. And it doesn't have a reliable ally in the South. The NATO question. Let's be serious, people. The non-US nuclear stockpiles are a joke. They are symbolic.
Didn't the last trident test that the UK tried fail?
Well, it might have. I have a feeling we supply them.
Yes,
With their
they
nuclear-
did try and test it.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah. So, but and I love France, but and I really do. I love going to Paris, but I believe that maybe France has more than. I think France only has one aircraft carrier. I mean, let's be honest here. There isn't a nuclear deterrent other than the United States and NATO. And I still believe that NATO, because I'm not sure what's happening in Greenland, which is why I was saying 4:12 p.m. I still think NATO is going. I think the nuclear part of NATO is going to survive. But that doesn't mean that this is going to be a very useful or functional alliance. And when I say nuclear, I mean against the Russians. I just don't know. But I still think the interests of all these countries, including the United States, will keep this thing going. It's just not going to be the NATO that we grew up with. China, I'll then stop right after saying this about China. The Canadians, the tech bros, have focused this administration on rare earth minerals. China has apparently all the rare earth minerals it needs in the AI sphere. We apparently don't. Reminds me of Cold War analysis of Soviet power, which were always exaggerating. But we live in the same world where it's not nuclear power anymore, it's AI power that we exaggerate. But there is a constant exaggeration about what the Chinese might do someday with the fact that they have a monopoly on rare earth minerals. And that, I don't think this logic works, but let me just follow it along. Greenland fits into this because Greenland apparently has as many rare earth minerals as the United States. And the two of them together would provide the United States with enough rare earth material, apparently. Okay. This is all sort of nonsense, okay? Because A, nobody knows how many rare earth minerals there are in Greenland. And B, Canada has more than enough rare earth minerals. The reason that we don't know how many are in Canada is that Canada, unlike the United States, chose a different path with its northern indigenous people. I am very critical of America's path with its southern indigenous people, but I think America's approach to its northern indigenous people has been remarkably good. Alaska is one of the richest states in this country. It has one of the lowest poverty rates in this country. Its Gini coefficient is lower than all, is the 47th lowest. Why? Because the US government cut a beautiful, great deal, not a beautiful bill, a great deal with the Native Alaskans in the 1970s. Canada has treated the northern part of Canada as a museum, which is fine. It has left the indigenous folks as it should. But the issue is there's no mechanism, there's no treaty or mechanism for the government of Canada to cooperate with the indigenous folks of the north to develop the rare earth minerals that, if they're in Greenland, they're in Baffin Island too. That's why no one talks about rare earth minerals, because Canada, unlike the United States, has not done a deal with its indigenous people. Should it do such a deal, there will be no need for Greenland Canada will be able to trade in rare earth minerals, but we don't know how many rare earth minerals there are there. Now, I am not suggesting to destroy the cultural sovereignty of the people of the North. I'm only saying that unlike the United States, Canada hasn't even done a deal. And the population in the Canadian North is minuscule. You think Greenland has very few people. The capital of half of the Canadian North has 7,000 people. Nuuk, I visited these places. Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, has 34,000. That's not a lot of people, but Canada's has 7,000. The people matter, but there are very few of them. So this whole business of a China and rare earth minerals is based on a series of myths, misunderstandings, and the fact that the Canadians haven't figured out what to do.
Elizabeth, the historian talked about the Gini coefficient.
Well, I did a political science thing.
What, we don't have a comments. Elizabeth, do you want to take the if there's been damage to the alliance, is it undoable post-Trump, or will it as a study?
The damage is done. I think it's going to be really, I mean, I agree about the nuclear piece of it, although it would not shock me if the Europeans decided to make their deterrent less than a joke. But I don't see, when Biden took office, there was all this, America's back, right? Like there were pieces in foreign affairs about this. And there's no doubt that he revived, partly because of Ukraine. There was a lot of intelligence sharing and there was a lot of effort put into rebuilding trust in American intelligence because of Iraq. And that was pretty successful. I mean, the mechanism of consultation through the US and NATO to sort of like be NATO against Russia in Ukraine without being NATO, I mean, that was remarkable, right? But this, I don't see how you come back from this, because first of all, we're so polarized. Was to say we won't elect somebody who would do that again. I mean, Trump went there and said the Danes have never done anything for us, and they have the most per capita casualties in Afghanistan, or was it Iraq, or I think it was Afghanistan, of any ally, more than us. So you know, and to insult the UK. The UK is letting us down over, I think, the Chagos Islands when they lost. I mean, you know, these are steadfast allies that have done. The only time, as you probably know, that the Article 5 has been invoked was after 9/11, in defense of the, you know, in support of the US. So maybe there'll be something new. Maybe it will include different countries. I mean, a lot of people have been fretting over Turkey being in NATO and, you know, nuclear weapons at the Incirlik base for a long time. And, you know, so as I said, questioning institutions is not bad, but I don't see how the Europeans can continue. I mean, the infrastructure of NATO and the, you know, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO is always an American. It just, these norms, the bargain doesn't work anymore, as Carney said. But the bargain doesn't work anymore in the trade case, I think, is much more of a long-term structural problem, whereas I could have seen the gradual decoupling or the reform in the security sphere. And then Trump went to Davos and, you know, told them that their civilization was gone, or whatever it was he said. So I'm pretty pessimistic about it, but I may be wrong. I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, just to add a couple of remarks about comments about NATO. You know, I think one of the errors in Trump's worldview, I think, is that he saw alliances as a drag on American resources, whereas actually I think it was one of the most valuable resources that we have, right? And there are all kinds of ways in which, in addition to material ways in which allies, and by the way, especially the Danes, have come to our assistance, we gain immensely from, for example, forward basing that we have throughout the world because of our alliances. One of the things that's, I think, tragic about Trump's approach to alliances and NATO is, you know, that he's actually right about a few things. I mean, although the United States was gaining far more than I think he appreciated from our NATO alliance, European allies weren't carrying enough of a burden, and he was actually being successful, I think, in extracting higher defense spending.
And this is one of those things where it's completely precedented. Because
Totally.
every US president since Eisenhower.
Yes.
Totally.
Has gone to Europe and said, you must invest.
No, and he was and he was positioned and was making progress in extracting higher commitments. He was right that I think NATO was not devoting enough attention to Arctic security. And to me, one of the tragedies is there were wins he could have had here, right? He actually could have been successful in greatly strengthening NATO. To me, again, that's a tragedy because I think it's one of the most valuable resources, right? If we were to think about, you know, would you rather have allies or critical minerals? Well, I guess I would say I want the allies that have critical minerals. Like those are the good ones to have, right? And we could have, right? We could have, we should have. That's what I wanted to add on NATO. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'm gonna ask one more of the questions that came in ahead of time and then open up to the floor and then maybe come back to some of the questions that came in ahead. So this one is also for you, Matt. And the question is, how should we understand the relationship between Trump's crackdowns domestically and his military actions abroad? If he mobilizes troops inside the US, will that affect US military posture abroad?
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. Trump has done so many things or talked about, threatened to do so many things with US military forces at home and abroad, every one of which has at least a precursor, if not a precedent. The distinction I would draw is sort of a precedent has acquired a certain kind of legitimacy. Precursors, I'm thinking of things that prior presidents did but that were scorned afterwards. But everything had at least precursors. What's remarkable is just how many of them Trump has done all in just 1 year. But among the things he's been looking to do with the military and kind of his agenda, I see a few. One, deploying the U.S. military in an aggressive counter-narcotics campaign, deploying or threatening to deploy the U.S. military as an instrument of immigration enforcement, waging a war on woke in the military, waging culture wars in the military, and increasing American defense spending is kind of related to reinstilling a sort of, I guess they call it warrior culture or lethality, let's change the name to Department of Defense, Department of War, kind of being a symbol of that. There again, I would say, there's some kernel of reasoning, or there's a problem that that needed some addressing in each of those agendas. But in each of them, I think he's stretched things so far or implemented them in such ham-handed and over-aggressive ways that I think he's defeated some of his own agendas and unleashed some dangerous forces. I think, for example, deploying the U.S. military for counter-narcotics, immigration enforcement, protection, things like that, they stretch the force. Right, the U.S. military is immensely capable, but it can't do everything all at once, and there are trade-offs. And I think that's a poor use. If you believe, as I do, in sort of peace through strength, that's a poor use of some of your military strength when you have other assets that you can, other tools you can bring to bear. I think he, in looking to strengthen the military, has placed some bad bets. I don't know how real this is, but a Trump class battleship. We don't need a new class of battleships. We do need to get faster at acquiring high technology. We do need to reindustrialize the base to produce enough artillery shells. Like, those are genuine problems, but he's spending attention on glamorous pieces, showy pieces that aren't really where the problem is. I think in trying to purge the military of what he has labeled insufficiently loyal, he calls them meritorious service members and officers, I think there's been a terrible brain drain. There's been an erosion of some very important aspects of the military ethos. And I think both in the kind of the culture wars he's waged within the military, and the use of the military or threatened use of the military domestically, I think he's eroded healthy civil military relations in a very dangerous way and politicized the military. And this was a problem that was already occurring, I think, was a tendency to use the military or former military officers as a bit of a political prop. But he turned that knob up, 100-fold. And I think that's dangerous among other things, among other reasons, because it puts, if you use the military as an arm of your domestic agenda, you're politicizing the military in a way that I think creates some political aversion on the other side, right? If you believe in strengthening US military hard power, what you don't want is to create an alienation between the political left and the military, right? What you want to do is really build bipartisan, a strong bipartisan relations between the civilian leadership, elites, the public, and the military. So I see that as quite dangerous. You know, this is I'll just say it's a wild time in all kinds of ways. It's a wild time for thinking about civil military relations. I was thinking to myself, you know, Tim and I were also teaching about the founding in our class yesterday. Yeah. Now, think about this. You know, in 2020, right, with the kind of contested election and concerns that Trump might deploy the military in some way that might pose an obstacle to the peaceful transfer of power. One of the things that was remarkable was I found was the number of people on what I would call the political left who are basically saying, thank God we have a big established standing army as a bulwark of Republican self-governance and democracy, right? Imagine if you read founding era documents, right, about what would be a threat to the, you know, American Republic and what would be a guardian. You didn't see a lot of people saying a really big, well-established standing military is the key there.
The complaint on January 6th was that they didn't call it National Guard.
But anyway, I'm very worried about what I see as an erosion of the military ethos, an erosion of public trust, bipartisan public trust in the military that I think is exacerbated by some of the ways in which the Trump administration is looking to use the military, especially domestically.
I know that I'm like, yeah, sure. So I think this connects to another theme that I know, Matt, you've written about, which is, you know, what word have we not uttered since we started? Congress, right?
Do they exist?
Well, that's why we haven't talked about that, right? But they used to, and I think one of the things that has been made really clear in this Trump in 2.0 is the complete absence of Congress, right? Especially on the Republican side. But when you look at the trends, and again, you can't lay it all at the door of Trump. There is a long-term trend here of accruing more and more presidential power. And the problem with presidential power is no one ever wants to give it back, right? So powers that are given, it's like sanctions. They're easy to put on and they're really hard to take off. So, you know, we can have a debate about whether the post 9/11 war powers were justified or not, but let's just assume for argument's sake that they were, and I think many of them were. Once you grant the president power, Congress doesn't like to vote on anything that can possibly avoid it, right? Anything other than like a Mother's Day resolution. And for a while, and you and I have had this conversation, like a lot of well-meaning international, national security lawyers would write things about how Congress must take back its war powers. But this is a political process, right? They don't want to take back their war powers because then they'd have to vote on war, which gets them in trouble and got a lot of them in trouble in 2002, in the 1991 Gulf War. It's just taking difficult votes is something you try to avoid at all costs. In 2013, when Barack Obama asked Congress to vote on authorizing the use of military force in Syria after the chemical weapons attack, remember this? Vladimir Putin and John Kerry worked out some deal, and then they didn't have to have the vote. And there was reporting. I teach this little teeny blog post from a reporter at Foreign Policy that the title is "Congress is thrilled not to have that the Syria vote was canceled." Because they don't want to have to vote on this stuff. They don't want to have voted no and denied the president power. They don't want to have voted yes and then the thing goes spectacularly wrong. They just don't want to. They love to complain that they weren't consulted. But that's why authorizations for the use of military force are so rare and why they don't want to vote to take them away, right? The 1957 Eisenhower doctrine is still on the books. The 2002
It was just lifted, but yeah.
was it though? Because I thought they.
I thought in the recent NDAA, but I mean.
Okay, so maybe they finally got rid of that one and the Iraq one, but not the 2001 AUMF to authorizing the use of force in Afghanistan. That has been the one that every president since has used everywhere, right? So I think what we have now, and so then you layer. This has been true. This has been a problem for at least 2 decades now. And I teach a great piece by Matt and Jack Saltzman, another excellent national security law scholar, the legal legacy of light footprint warfare, right? So this idea that you can just do drone strikes, like war has become more invisible and the presidential power has gotten greater. So the possibilities to rein it in, since it's a one-way ratchet of giving power to the president, it's sort of escaped constraint. So you layer on top of that the election of somebody like Trump, who in his first term had advisors around him who would restrain some of his impulses. And now you don't have that. You have a Congress that doesn't even want to stop him from doing tariffs or, other things. So definitely is not going to stop him from doing Venezuela or whatever, ex ante, like before the operation happens. This is a recipe, like the constraints are gone in the Supreme Court's immunity decision. So there's no shadow. The way that Congress most effectively reins in the president on the use of military force is the shadow of political punishment, right? It's not a vote. It's the shadow of what could happen if you do something that is politically unpopular or members of Congress decide to block other things you care about. And that's just, that shadow is gone. And so I think that if we want to think about rebuilding the kinds of constraints that lawyers write about, I mean, I'd love to know what you think about like how to even go about doing that. Because I think the old framework of war powers is broken sort of for a long time, but there was a point where I mean, I've looked at documents in the Lebanon intervention, the Reagan administration, like they wrote a lot of memos about the war powers, like creeping up to the line of when they would have to invoke the hostilities provision, right? That the shadow of that really had teeth. I don't think it does.
Yeah, although, one of the things that we'll see is, sometimes it takes a while for the checks to mobilize, right?
Yeah.
I served in the Bush administration and, in 2002, it would have been very easy to say that when it comes to counterterrorism operations and the use of military force, the president is imperial, unilateralist, he's been given blank check, etc. By 2008, both of the other branches had really checked the president in some significant ways. Tim would be an expert on the Vietnam War, but if you said in 1965, the president sure looked imperial.
Yeah.
In 1970, the very same legislators who were sponsoring the Gulf of Tonkin resolution were among the strongest checkers. So sometimes it does take a while. And one of the things that's interesting that we just saw in the last couple of days is, this isn't a Madisonian check, but markets need to be a potent check.
The CEOs in Davos talked to.
Yeah.
But that isn't the way it's supposed to work, right?
Well, that's why I say it's not a very Madisonian one, but yeah.
But remember, we've been talking about the George Washington's farewell address, and the first part of the farewell address, we've actually talked about in our class, that I have, is about parties and why the United States shouldn't have political parties.
Yeah, but he didn't mean that. He knew there were parties. He just
It's under fact. Well, the problem with one of the checks on the president is the president now has a party, and it's very unlikely that we'll ever see a 2/3 majority in the Senate remove a president. Because unless the president's party is less than 1/3, it's not gonna happen. I just wanted to raise a point about the nature of the parties, because I think that matters too. In the first Trump term, there were many of us who I think wrongly were looking to the Nixon era as a source of useful precedents. In my case, I had spent a lot of time studying Nixon as the director of the library, but it proved wrong because the nature of the Republican Party had changed. In fact, the nature of the party had changed, and this is not an issue of foreign policy, and it's an issue of the nature of how we organize parties these days. Richard Nixon had almost no loyalty in the Republican Party, and Donald Trump owns the Republican Party in a way that is unusual for an American president. When I say Richard Nixon had no loyalty, he won a huge victory in 1972, landslide victory, with no coattails. Democrats controlled the House and the Senate. He didn't work that hard. He worked in '66 in between, but he didn't really work that hard to get Republicans elected. He didn't choose Republicans. He didn't primary Republicans. He wanted to build a new party. It was going to be the conservative party of the United States, and it was going to be founded on a new base, which would be disaffected Southern Democrats who didn't like the dismantling of Jim Crow, of the racist regimes that dominated in the South for 100 years. So Nixon was much more interested in Southern Democrats, and Nixon, if he had had his way, would have had a Southern Democrat as his vice president. He was forced to choose Gerald Ford. Sorry to go through this history, but I miss history. Gerald Ford by Republicans, who said, we're not going to confirm a former Democrat as your vice president. We're only going to confirm a Republican. So Richard Nixon didn't have deep wells of Republican, elected Republican loyalty, and they waited a while to turn on him, but they were able to turn on him, and he tried to use bare knuckle tactics to scare them and failed. This is a different administration. The Trump administration, unfortunately, is much better at instilling fear in Republicans. But even that has a limit, as we saw in Indiana, where I know some people in Indiana and people in politics in Indiana, there was a real effort to scare people to redistrict Indiana. It didn't work, which shows a limit on President Trump's ability to instill fear. But his control of the Republican Party may be unique. That's all I wanted to say. It had paralyzed Congress, but I don't know if it's future. I don't know if it's the future, but I don't know.
The way in which it is the future is the polarization, right? That both parties, I've looked at some of the public opinion data, like basically whatever the president does, members of Congress from his own party will support and the others will oppose. There's no bipartisan coalition in the middle that you can build. And so the traditional, my view on this is that we need more politics of national security. Like, people always love to say how terrible it is to play politics with national security. That's how we resolve disputes in a democracy. You want to have people debating, you want reasonable people to disagree and then come to some sort of compromise. And that used to be possible when you had a distribution that was, a classic normal distribution. And now it's.
Can I just put an asterisk on that, though? Yes, there's no question you have a presidential party, but there is something going on now.
Yes,
and I'll give you an example.
True.
All right, you have a president who vetoes a water bill in a state that has direct implications for the economy and the well-being of the state of Colorado. And his elected Republicans are too scared to say, now that's new. In the past, you would have seen Republicans stand up for, they would have stood up for basic things for their own people.
Well, so can I ask Matt a question then about this? Because they always say never let a good crisis go to waste. So after, like, the War Powers Resolution was a response to Watergate. And the Times, New York Times, had a great long thing about the post-Watergate reforms, and the norms of the Justice Department came out of that, right? So it's certainly possible. And the War Powers Resolution, as you know better than I do, has been broken for a while. The mechanism, right? But we do know that these constraints can kick in. If you could, is there any way in which we could view this as an opportunity to think about a new way, like wipe the slate clean and come up with new mechanisms? What would they be?
Yeah, it's so, and this is really where actually Tim's historical expertise is key. I mean, you could imagine a real pendulum swing after the Trump administration, especially if the Democrats were to sweep in. You could imagine a congressional and judicial response to perceived executive overreach. I mean, that was one of the things that happened at a smaller scale with the Bush administration, was I think it overreached in its assertion of powers to exercise, a presidential power to exercise military and other related instruments free of any legislative control. And you had both branches pushing back against that kind of overreach. And to Tim's point, and because I was part of these debates and deliberations, one of the legislative responses to that executive overreach was something called the Detainee Treatment Act of 2005, restricting basically legislatively creating stronger protection for detainees in the custody of any US government agency. And that passed 90-9 in the Senate because John McCain, like a Republican, championed it, right? And it wasn't just McCain, it was McCain and Graham and Warner and others. So I think Tim's right that there was a different time, but there can be this this pendulum swing in response to presidential overreach. It's hard to know, though, what form that is going to take because of a point, Elizabeth, that you raised, which is having delegated a lot of emergency powers to the president. It's very, very hard now to take them back. So, just as an example, the president, all of the tariffs that the president, or 99% of the ones that Tim talked about on Liberation Day, were enacted under a very, very broad statutory delegation of power that Congress gave to the president in the 1970s. It goes by the acronym IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The president declares a national emergency and then can do all kinds of economic and financial actions, and can keep doing them unless Congress affirmatively passes a resolution kind of undeclaring this emergency. Now, the problem with passing a resolution undeclaring that emergency is Congress has to pass it not just by a bare majority in both houses, it needs to pass it by a veto-proof majority. There's what I think a lot of people would think would be a sensible statutory fix to this, which is, all right, if you think the president ought to have some emergency powers, as I do, because actual emergencies and crises happen, and Congress is by design very slow. So I think the president should have a lot of emergency powers. But wouldn't it make sense for that emergency to to automatically sunset or expire after 6 months or a year. And so rather than Congress having to pass by a veto-proof majority a resolution undeclaring emergency, why not have it expire automatically, and Congress would have to affirmatively re-up the
But isn't that
emergency,
the-
flip that. Kind of, and the problem though there again is, well, the statute's already on the books. And now you'd need a veto-proof majority to change it. So I actually think statutory reform is very, very hard. What I would say, the final point on this though, is Congress has a lot of power short of exercising legislative power and enacting laws, acts into positive law. It can hold hearings. It can hold hostage other presidential priorities. It has its own bully pulpits that it can use. It requires some will and coordination and so on. But Congress can exercise checks short of actually passing statutes into positive law.
For example, the way in which Congress tried to restrain Ronald Reagan's foreign policy in Latin America, which led to the Iran-Contra scandal. Now, the fact that there was an Iran-Contra scandal is evidence that the executive branch tried to get around this, but they got into a lot of trouble and lost a lot of energy, and in fact, it really affected Ronald Reagan. So there, in the 1980s, Congress used its power of the purse to try to restrain presidential foreign policy. So it's very possible, and I would throw out there just to think about that. President Trump anticipates losing the House, and some of the explanation, besides his ego and just ADD personality, is that he's trying to front load a lot of stuff until before the midterms. But, and because he anticipates that Congress is going to come back to life next January.
Let's take a few questions from the audience, and then I'll come back to maybe some that were submitted in advance. So, please.
What do you think about the Board of Peace and the people we chose to have on it? Because I don't see too many high-level European leaders on it. Like,
That's good.
I mean, I'll take that one because I actually I talked about it in class today. I mean, a week ago, I think you might have seen more European leaders on it because they all flew to Sharm el-Sheikh after the Gaza ceasefire. And, you know, they had they were, you know, Starmer was there, Merz was there, I think Macron was there, maybe he wasn't, but there was a reason. Anyway, you can look at the picture of that and the flags, and, you know, they were all there. And I think Greenland is the thing that prevented them. So that doesn't mean the Board of Peace is good or bad, or, you know, but I think the reason the European leaders are not there is because of Greenland in support. I mean, that has been the thing that has changed the tone in Europe, especially in the UK, because, you know, they've always tried to play this Trump whisperer kind of role. Whether the Board of Peace, the most interesting thing that a colleague of ours yesterday, Peter Clement, who is a former intelligence, you know, CIA analyst and also former director of Saltzman, said, you know, it's not necessarily so great for Russia to, at first you think, well, this is great because, you know, better than the UN, I pay my $1 billion and, you know, get Trump to do whatever. But the problem for Russia is, at least in the UN, they always have a veto. And I see our Russia expert, Kim Martin, nodding vigorously, which I take to be a good sign when I attempt to say anything about Russia. This is a bit like the charter is very Trump, whatever Trump says goes. And maybe Russia prefers the UN, in that sense. So I don't know that it's I don't know that even adversaries necessarily think it's so great.
I was just going to add, you know, I thought of this when you mentioned the Board of Peace. We've been grading a lot of Trump policies very poorly. I want to grade some things incomplete. And just, just to mention a few, I'm quite thrilled that there has been a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, I consider that one incomplete because the question is, well, now what comes next, right? I am delighted to see Iran's nuclear program set back. The question now is, well, what comes next? Incomplete. I'm thrilled to see Maduro gone. Incomplete. What's gonna come next? So I want to give some credit, at least partial credit, for some.
And all these things
Some
fall
acts.
in a category of like reasonable people can.
Totally.
No. Why did
The question is now.
Ceasefire.
Now the question is, so what follows? And I do worry that the governing style, this comes back to a point I made at the beginning, it fits very well with his personal style for Trump to exercise unilateral tools. And I don't mean just unilateral from other branches. I mean things he can do from the Oval Office, with a phone. But the hard part now is following through, where not only might you need international partners to do a lot of things, but you need the intelligence community, the military, the State Department, and others. And I don't think he has built and is managing even the executive branch in a way that is likely to be effective in the execution phase. For what follows. So I'm very, very worried about these incomplete grades that I'm giving. But I do want to acknowledge at least some short-term gains that I'm delighted about.
I just wanted to add that President Biden built on the Abraham Accords. And to the extent that the Board of Peace puts Arab government skin in the game, it's a good thing. This is an element of the story that we don't often talk about. But I wish I knew more about what Qatar is up to. But there is no doubt that Qatar and UAE and Saudi Arabia are more involved in Gaza than they used to be involved, but not in a helpful way. And they're now more involved. And to the extent that they can take some position to help the vulnerable people of Gaza, that is a great thing for the world. I don't know if it's going to happen, and I share the view of my colleagues here that the problem with the Trump administration is always follow through. I think my professor in grad school always cautioned me not to engage in historical parallels because they usually fall apart. But they are instructive. The one I have in mind for the president of the United States is Wilhelm II, a man who suffered from FOMO. Do you know what FOMO means? Place in the sun. Really irrational. I mean, study the whole Samoa issue, and unfortunately, destabilized Europe and it led to World War I. I don't think that will happen now, but he had Bismarck, and he had until Beckman Holweg, it was a disaster. He had people get implemented, but one of the problems with 2.0 is that Donald Trump, the American people learned from January 6th different lessons, but Donald Trump learned a series of lessons from January 6th. He remembered everybody who wasn't loyal to him. He doesn't want a cabinet that could turn against him. That's why we're not going to have a 25th Amendment. He knows. We don't even know. Even Jack Smith doesn't know how close we came to something like that on January 6th. That we know that some members of his cabinet just disappeared. He does not want. So he's chosen people who are not capable of serious good government. And so I don't know on the issue of Gaza how much follow through there will be. Once they slap his name on something, will he just walk away? I don't know.
I think there's also a difference between the good things he might achieve, or Kushner and Witkoff might achieve in Gaza specifically, and using the Board of Peace as a substitute for the United Nations in all other conflicts, right? That's a new development that would be.
Well, and by the way, and this is it's a very sad and difficult and solemn time. It's also a very exciting time to be studying this kind of thing because we have all these new agreements, so-called agreements with countries that are so vague that we really don't know what they mean. Like the United States is setting up a special board with Congo. Now I could say that it's the Democratic Republic of Congo. I could say it probably has to do with cobalt, but I don't know. But we don't know what it is. And we don't know which companies are going to be invited to build that road between Azerbaijan, all right, from part A of Azerbaijan to part B of Azerbaijan through Armenia. None of this is clear. We just have all these. So there is a whole level of US engagement in the world with sovereign wealth funds and other authoritarian regimes. We don't have one yet. We have a plague authoritarian regime that acts in an authoritarian manner at times. We don't know what that's going to mean. We really don't, because a lot of this is really gray, and that goes back to Witkoff, and I mean he's been involved in I think all of them. Jared Kushner's not been involved in all of them. So there's a level of our engagement in the world that is totally unclear. It's not transparent at all. And yes, I have a feeling it has to do with corruption. Yes, but that's important in thinking about follow through and the Board of Peace, because how much of the Board of Peace will be about PIECE as opposed to PEACE? In other words, getting a piece of something, getting some mineral.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, on the Board of Peace, when I don't get me there, because I think it's a very bad thing, but I think one has to recognize it's a triumph of America. It's a triumph of American diplomacy. It's remarkable that the Security Council adopted a resolution to support to create a board whose composition was unknown, whose rules of procedure were unknown. That's a remarkable illustration of the success of bullying. It's extraordinary. But that wasn't my question. My question is on what you said about the nuclear stuff. And I was surprised, not that you said not about France, because that's another story, but about the American nuclear umbrella over Europe. I think there is some continuity in the sense that for a while that there's been tensions between the Europeans and the Americans on the evolution of the nuclear doctrine. The Europeans don't want no first use. They want, because they see that as very dangerous for extended deterrence. And that when you said that is the one thing that would survive, I think that's the one thing that is already in very bad shape. And the notion that that there is still some kind of extended deterrence under Trump, maybe if the Golden Dome was working wonderfully, but that's a pie in the sky, maybe that would improve the possibility of extended deterrence, but in the present circumstances, I don't see it. And I'm not saying that because I believe that French nuclear deterrence would substitute for it. I don't think it can, not for the reasons that you mentioned, not because there's one aircraft carrier, actually there's going to be two, but I tried to convince the president of France when I did the review of French defense that it was stupid to build an aircraft carrier, and even more stupid to build two. And if there is any extended deterrence of France it would rely not on submarines, because submarines you cannot have any kind of gradual response. It would have to rely on planes and missiles attached to the Rafale, but I don't think there's enough capacity for that. We could increase the number of nuclear weapons probably from 300 to 290 to 600, 700 with not too much difficulty. But the political obstacle would be enormous. So that's the reason. The political obstacle in the US is enormous, but I think in France it's less, but it still is there.
I I understand that the point I made was counterintuitive. I share, your a sense of the problems with political problems with the American nuclear umbrella. And I know something about the tensions and that whole issue of no first use. But I'll just put on the table that I think even in the Trumpian world, that the United States will recognize the value of at least the stability in Europe that comes from a nuclear umbrella. I may be totally wrong, and maybe there is no bottom to this, but it seems to me that the economic and state, the benefits in terms of stability that comes from knowledge that Europe can deter the Russians with its nuclear weapons is worth a lot to the United States, even in a Trumpian world. But I could be, I'm sad, I know I can be wrong, I am often, but I hope I'm not wrong about this. But.
Yep.
Hi, Kim Martin from the Barnard Political Science Department. I'm not going to talk about Russia, I'm going to talk about the Arctic. And I have a different perspective than Tim does on the cases that he mentioned. So it is true that there are an indigenous population in Alaska that has benefited a lot from the oil, but there's another indigenous population that has not benefited at all because the profits from it are not equally distributed. And Alaska is not wealthy right now. It is actually in a recession that's worse than the rest of the country. And I was just in both Sitka and Juneau over the summer, and there's a lot of poverty there. And it's because the oil industry is losing interest in Alaska. And I think this matters for Greenland, so I'll get to that in a second. But the second thing is that Canada actually was in somewhat of a similar situation with its indigenous population, in that those who lived on the coasts were benefiting from offshore oil drilling, and Canada decided to stop it. But now, recently, with the 2024 Devolution Act, they've given Nunavut, which is largely an indigenous area, control over the natural resources. And so that brings us to Greenland, where the indigenous population, which is 85% of the population of Greenland, controls domestic policy, which means that they control the distribution of contracts going to natural resources. And the reason that they voted against the combination of China and Australia having a company that would develop rare earth minerals is because they were afraid of the environmental consequences of radiation that was a natural byproduct of that mining. And so I think a lot of that complication is not something that we ever hear about when we think about what Trump is doing and what kinds of things that he is answering. This leads me to a completely unrelated question, but it's sort of related, which is that even China seems to be more concerned about climate change than Trump is. And that is something that is also really unique about him. When we look at even prior Republican presidents in the United States, when we think about Nixon, when we think about the first George H.W. Bush, they actually pushed in favor of environmentalism and climate change accords. That's something where Trump really stands out, and he's losing to China because China understands the economic value of having, even if it doesn't always practice good environmental things at home, it understands the benefit of making itself seem like a climate change leader with new technologies. So I'll stop there. That's a lot.
You should take that one. You're the climate change expert.
I'm not sure there was a question. I'm not sure what I'm responding to. I mean, I tend to, I agree with you. And I think it's been remarkable, the shift in how the world sees China, both as it has accelerated the development and the export of electric vehicles, solar panels, et cetera, at the same time that the US has done a 180 on climate. And I think it is shifting. I noted that the way you sort of framed the end of that was really a soft power issue, that China is gaining soft power by making itself a leader, also economic power. So hard power on that. But I think it is also, there's a soft power element of it, of, who is leading on this and who is no longer leading on this. So I think it's a remarkable shift, and time in terms of that. And I've been trying to puzzle through how those shifts and the issue of climate change and decarbonization in general are affecting things like Venezuela and Greenland. One full of resources that will be stranded if the world decarbonizes. There's sort of a doubling down on a fossil fuel economy, and then Greenland for rare earth minerals and things that are needed to decarbonize. There's something odd going on there that I haven't sorted out yet, but I think it's super interesting.
I just want to say that the movement away from fossil fuels have definitely affected Alaska's economy. And I'm not suggesting that we return to fossil fuels, but I wanted to make a point about how the US government was much better in its approach to the indigenous population of Alaska in terms of making them a partner in the development in a time when, even though the EPA had been started, there wasn't quite the same concern about fossil fuels as there understandably is now. And the Canadian government, as it examines Arctic security, is going to have to be a partner with the indigenous people of Nunavut. And that's just, it's inevitable because the climate change is going to make that entire, if you will, the strait that goes along Baffin Island is going to be ice-free. And Canada doesn't have a port up there. Canada's military presence is one base up there. So I'm not suggesting that Canada should militarize, but I think that one of the challenges of climate change for Canada, besides the effect on its economy, because it's a fossil fuel exporting country, is to think about the Arctic space and in a more complicated way than it has up to now, while respecting indigenous rights. It's going to be a balancing act, but it hasn't engaged in that balancing act up to now.
Question here.
Good evening. Thank you again for this talk. Really quickly, small anecdote. When I was a kid, I saw some fire. I thought it was interesting. My mom said, "Don't touch the fire." I touched the fire and I burned my hand. And then I didn't touch fire again ever in my life, right? Learn from that mistake. Another small little parallel. I feel like we're in a space right now where we might be learning from what the Trump 2.0 is doing to the global world order in a much faster way than we may have been able to learn certain lessons, because political science is like a thing. You can't go into a lab and pop a policy there and see how it turns out. You just have to enact it, see what happens, deal with the consequences, and hopefully learn and grow. So if I can ask sort of an optimistic question, might Trump 2.0 be somewhat of a catalyst to, towards a resurgence of a global commitment to cooperation and peace? Because when I was thinking, oh, if I were the president, I would just bomb this, like 16 years old, I would just bomb them or something like that. And now we're seeing those actions and the immediate, implications of those. Might there be a world in which, the entire global world realizes, oh, these powers are there, they exist, but if we utilize them in this manner, we now know how that happens. We now have the experience. The experience and the experiment, we sort of, time will play it out, but we see how it's playing out. And if the midterms go a certain way, we might see a way to, reseat the presidency eventually, and then maybe use this history to inform our future in a much more informed way. Is that a possibility, or are we just very pessimistic that we can't pop back because we've gone too far out?
I'll take that one if you want. So I'll give you partially optimistic. As I say, I think there's a world in which there's like the post-Watergate reforms. But I think I like to say political science is the study of why the right policy doesn't get chosen. right? Over and over and over again. You see the policy that the economists have their, sorry if there are any economists here, like they're hermetically sealed models, they have no politics in them. So they'll say, build a, I've already forgotten, what was the famous like market, carbon market?
Carbon tax.
Carbon tax, yeah, or carbon tax.
Or carbon
Yeah,
tax, yeah.
yeah, carbon tax, the most efficient, you know, there's like a trillion reasons why carbon tax will never be politically viable, right? So what you have to do instead is to try to set things up so that the political incentives, again, this goes back to like, we can't denigrate politics as a part of national security. It's all political, so we have to try to make the politics work so that you get, you know, at least good debate, right? And these are often you're dealing with hard questions, real emergencies. So you want to have a setup that allows people to kind of make the best possible choice under uncertainty. Bob Jervis always had a lot of sympathy for policymakers. Right now, you have a policymaker who has no checks, no emergency, and that's not, and is just, you know, it's using US power and spending it down all of these resources. So one thing you could do, I mean, one positive thing that comes from the tragedy of not just the end of USAID, but the manner in which USAID was studied rapidly, is that you can build something new rather than reforming the old. And nobody would deny that USAID had a lot of problems, but it was also a source of soft power. And also you just do not unwind something that big in the way it was done. I mean, it was terrible for people, for the people it benefited. It was also terrible, and I know many of them, for people who worked for USAID and were stranded, or, you know, I mean, it's just a catastrophe on every level, the way it was executed. But, you know, it's hard to reform old institutions. So this time, you know, people need to be thinking now about that. I also think a really unheralded thing that would be good, and I don't totally know how you would implement it, but I'm sure there are Congress experts who can attest to this. I tend to be pessimistic about formal procedures that you could change for all the reasons Matt suggested, right? The way Congress gets things done is it's all these other political things they can do, right? This is a huge part of the most recent book that I published. But one reason why, an unheralded reason why Congress is no longer able to do that is because it's no longer considered politically important to have expertise on foreign policy, on nuclear weapons. If you wanted to get anything passed in the Cold War on nuclear stuff, you had to go through Sam Nunn, right? He was the one who knew everything there was to know about nukes, and he could bring along, you know, 20 Democratic votes. So you would just go to him and you made a deal with him, and then you had the votes, right? And people like to bag on these committee chairs, but it used to be that the committee chairs had a lot of power, a lot of accrued knowledge. They had the incentive. Again, you need incentives to invest in this knowledge, to be the expert on Europe, to be the expert on tariffs, whatever it is, healthcare. I mean, it's not all foreign policy. And I think the reforms that have weakened the power of committee chairs and centralized the power of leadership, you know, that's where the healthcare bills get written, or the Republican response to Obamacare. There's so much we've had concentrated power in the executive, but the power within Congress has been also very concentrated. So you want it to be politically cool again, to be the congressperson on an issue. Because if otherwise, there's no connection between policy and politics. It's simply which team you're on. And that's not policy making. That's whoever wins getting all the power, right? It has to be possible for the president's party, somebody in Congress to say, I've studied this and I don't think it's a good idea. Whether that's in private, it's sometimes good to have this stuff not go public because nobody takes a vote, nobody gets embarrassed. So I do think that it's possible, but you gotta have more politics in it, not less.
It's up to your generation.
That too.
And, no, I'm.
No pressure.
No, but I wanna mention something, when we talked about most consequential foreign policy decision, I answered in terms of the state of the international system. But if you wanna know the one that's gonna have the most consequence in certain parts of the world, it's that we don't do PEPFAR anymore. Think of the people who are gonna die of AIDS.
They did actually go back,
Did they give all of it back?
maybe not all of it, but yeah,
Some. And
but
think
that is a
of-
good example.
And think about the money we used to spend to help countries set up electoral systems. We have a government that isn't interested, actually, because it sees that as a way for people that it doesn't agree with to win. We've got a whole bunch of very important elections in Europe coming up. And we know already which side the White House is on. And this is very open about what it wants. And so the question is, how all of you, sorry, the pressure on you, your age, react. Not that America isn't deciding, because I think it's not healthy to think that it's all up to the United States. That was understandable in the Cold War, but it's not healthy anymore. But how are you going to react to more TikTok images of sadness and sickness around the world and here because of Maha? And that, I think, is going to mean more than any institutional shift at all. But unfortunately, it takes time, and you don't have power yet. So just bear with us. Help is on the way, but you're the help. You're going to help. You're the ones that help the rescue.
So there are several hands up. I also still have some excellent questions that were, so I think let's collect a bunch of questions. I might throw in a few. Please keep questions short, and then I will give you each, like 90 seconds at the end, and you can choose which ones you want to respond to. So this one first.
Hi, so it was mentioned here that Trump anticipates losing the House and the Congress soon, and that Congress will come back to life. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on what we should expect from that. What would be the ideal outcome?
Okay, don't answer that yet. And then there's a question in the back.
I just maybe related to that. So thanks for this event. My question is very simple. So with all this, do you guys have any view or outlook on the mid-year election? Thank you.
And in the whites. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this. I know we're talking about Trump 2.0 here, and he has already mentioned about running another term. And I guess my question is, how likely are we going to see a Trump 3.0?
Okay, let's take one more from the audience there. Apologies to others who have questions.
Hi, so I'm from the Ministry of Defense, and I'm just wondering, so how do you foresee Trump's foreign policy actions affecting the international rules-based order and the actions of other powers such as Russia and China, both in the short term and beyond his term? And I think that hopefully directing this towards Professor Waxman, but also opening up to others.
So I'm going to combine a couple of the questions that came in just to add to this list. So there's one about whether the Trump administration is solely responsible for the growing irrelevance of international law, or has that been a longer process? One about the future of a role for the UN and other norm-setting international organizations in an increasingly might makes right world, which we touched on a bit with the Board of Peace, but I think it's a larger question. We've already kind of answered, or at least not answered, but spoken on one on the reduced US involvement in foreign aid. otherwise skip that one. Great question about the relationship between the Trumpist neo-imperial project and the new Cold War with China, which we talked about China some, but not a ton. And then I was going to throw in my last question of, if Carney is right and the old world order is dead, long live the old world order, I'm not going to ask you to predict what the new world order is going to be, because I know you're going to say, don't know, and it's complicated, but what things should we be paying attention to in the following months and in the second year of Trump 2.0 that might shape that? And then pick and choose from all of those questions in your response, and maybe we go in reverse order this time. You willing to take a shot at some of those back?
Sure. So I've got too many thoughts swirling around, so I'll just throw out a few of them, especially about international law, international governance. And I teach international law, but I like to think I'm a realist about the limits of it. First of all, I would say international law, at least sort of global international legal institutions, were already facing some pretty severe problems in recent years before Trump. I mean, I think he's helped to sort of push some of them over the cliff or push them down when they were limping along. But the UN Security Council was largely paralyzed on a lot of issues. The World Trade Organization's dispute settlement body has been in coma because there are no members of the appellate body. That predates Trump. There's a UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but in its biggest ruling concerning South China Sea, Philippines, China, the loose side China doesn't seem to hold it in much regard. The International Criminal Court has taken on, I think mistakenly, two of the highest profile international conflicts going on in recent years. Nobody's from those conflicts is going to find themselves in the dock. I think the International Court of Justice has, in my view, embarrassed itself in some recent rulings. If you think about international law as kind of big global judicial institutions, the record has not been good. I think they've proven themselves incapable of solving big problems. I do think, however, that international rules have provided a lot of predictability and coordination in the international system. I think even if international law was not functioning effectively on a global scale, it was dealing effectively with a lot of regional issues. I think there was a good system of rules that, let's call it the West, the United States, and a lot of its Western allies were championing. And I think it was a better legal order than the one that, for example, China was pushing. And I think we squandered in that competition between a number of international legal models. I think we've squandered a real advantage there. So I think the sort of the punchline is international law, international rules were already in some trouble, and the Trump administration has accelerated some of that decline and failed to build up and expand those rules in ways that the United States actually had a lot of power to its own benefit.
I'll take yours and I'll on indicators, and I will talk about the subject that I know the least about, which is the international economy. I think from watching the response to the tariffs and Liberation Day, and then sort of my sideline obsession with Brexit and, the succession of prime ministers who tried to grapple with it. If you remember Liz Truss and the lettuce, remember that? The thing that got both of those things, like really the constraining thing, was the bond market. And so I know nothing about the bond market, except that it seems to be the thing that the policymakers say is more important than the stock market. And sort of crudely understand it as like a measure of the value, the safety of the economy, right? I couldn't begin to tell you whether this is a serious risk of like de-dollarization. That's, you gotta ask IPE people. But I do think that the bond market clearly got to Trump in April, right? He said the bond market got yippee. It wasn't the S&P 500, it was the bond market. Apparently the other day, the stock market was, the stock market rebounded, but I guess the bond market yields actually didn't. So, when a country with as big a debt as us and our reliance, we do need to rebuild the defense industrial base. Like, we need more welders to make ships and artillery and all that stuff. But we're not going to rebuild the manufacturing base. Like, we are going to be an importing country. And we cannot function without that kind of exchange. And if people lose confidence in the dollar, like that would be a big indicator.
Trump 3.0, sorry, I'm do this. Trump 3.0 is not likely. It's not likely for two reasons. One, by the way, I always want the President of the United States to be in good health, because you do not want a sick person with the finger on the bomb, ever. But the president is failing. I don't mean that I'm not suggesting that I know something more than you do, but his mental stamina is questionable and is getting weaker. He was mistaking Iceland for Greenland, not just once. And so we're talking about 3 years from now. So I think, first of all, that we have again an elderly president, and that's going to be an issue. And secondly, I know American lawyers are so talented. I teach with one, but it's hard to get out of the prescription against a third term in our Constitution. 2, midterms. That's a trick question. We're not supposed to predict. But let me just say, standing right now at this moment, it looks like a blue wave, right? But we don't know, because things could change. But a couple of things to look for. One, affordability is linked to tariffs. Tariffs have not produced as bad a reaction as many economists thought, but I would argue that the tariffs have slowed the Biden recovery. We were seeing an economic recovery from the pandemic. We can have a debate over the extent to which Congress probably overspent, which drove up inflation, but there was clearly a recovery. That slowed. Unemployment right now, it's 4.5. It was about 4 when the president took office. Inflation, roughly the same, 1 or 2 point, 0.1 or 1% difference. Interest rates should be a lot lower. They're not a lot lower because Jerome Powell is stubborn. They're not a lot lower because inflation didn't come down as much as I would argue it would have come down. Mortgage rates are still 5.9%. I don't see that changing dramatically in the next 4 or 5 months. And when you study midterm elections, things get baked in by about August. That's when people decide whether or not they're in August, early September. So we got months to go, and things could change. But ceteris paribus, it looks like a blue wave. That doesn't mean the Dems will get the Senate, but they might actually narrow the gap there. Okay. Finally, I just wanted to make a point about debt. Elizabeth, I'm so glad she raised that question, and I am also not knowledgeable enough, but I would put this out there. I've always been perplexed by the fact that economists in Trump's orbit have not reined in his statements about crypto. Because at the center, I would argue, of American power is our dollar as a reserve currency. It allows us to do so much that our allies can't do. We can go into debt and survive it. Nobody really knows how much in debt we should go, but we can really go into debt And that has allowed the Congress to be lazy, right? Because we haven't had to balance the budget, even come close. I'm not saying we should balance it, but the tariff income is not gonna make up for the $3 trillion that we're not gonna get in revenue because of the big beautiful bill. So you play around with crypto and you are setting up, I say, a challenger to the US dollar. Why in anyone's, I was gonna say one in God's name, but I'm gonna keep this not secular. Why would you do that when the dollar is central to your power? Unfortunately, I believe it has to do with corruption, and it has to do with the people making money around the president in the crypto world. I'm watching that story because it's the undermining of this dollar. I'm not saying our, maybe not all, we have someone from Singapore and others from, maybe not from the United States. And that's what makes Colombia wonderful. But the undermining of the US dollar would be one of the great it would be a self-inflicted harm. And America has been lucky up to now that the Chinese have not let their dollar float. If they ever did, we would have a real challenger. And why this government is even helping along crypto, which is a potential challenger, I can't explain. But that to me could be one of the great issues of the next few years if we see an erosion of the United States dollar as its reserve currency.
So we're at time. I want to thank the audience for coming, for excellent questions. Far too many excellent questions than we could really get into that, like, you know, Trump 2.0. Whatever next week or whatever. So thank you all for coming. Enjoy the snow to get some this weekend. Please join me in thanking our panelists.